a way to just at least briefly dip your toe in. He's a super old school writer. He's actually, interestingly enough, also an honorary graduate of this university, because he, at some point, way back in the day, like in the 60s or something, or the 70s.
All right, everyone, we'll get going. We have our live stream working, so I know people will be joined at home. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the territory in which we gather is the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the Newfoundland Island as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq. I would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuhivut, and the Innu of the Tasman and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. Together we strive for respectful relationships with all peoples on this land as we move together for collective healing through reconciliation and honor this beautiful land and its ocean together. So I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Adjei. He's an associate professor and the interim dean of the School of Social Work here at Memorial. He's gained national and international recognition as a public speaker, so we're lucky to have him. A trainer, a consultant, and a researcher in the area of social justice, black racism, critical race, critical whiteness studies, and anti-colonialism. He has offered anti-racism training to many federal and provincial government agencies. He was recently awarded the Diaspora Fellowship to the University of Ghana, a Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Award that sends the recipient to African institutions of higher education to contribute to research, capacity building, and curriculum development. Please welcome Paul.
Thank you very much. I will also want to reaffirm that I am a guest to the land on which Memorial University campuses are situated, and the lands are in the traditional territories of diverse indigenous groups. I acknowledge with respect the diverse history and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and the Inuit of this province. Now, land acknowledgement has become a common phenomenon that we all do, in any particular spaces that we find ourselves. But for many people, land acknowledgement means different things. But for me, as a visitor to this important land acknowledgement is a reminder to me about the sacrifices that the owners of this land have paid in order to make it possible for me to be here. I also understand that these sacrifices has come at the human, ecological, and spiritual and emotional cost to indigenous people. So this also calls for a responsibility in terms of what I can also do on my part to make this place a better place. But I also draw on African proverb, which says that if an alligator, is capable of eating its own eggs, what will it not do to the skin of the frog? Oftentimes, the wisdoms of my elders tells me that when you are entering into a village or a community, and at the entrance, you see that the chief, who is supposed to be the head of the community, is being dragged on the street. You don't ask whether this land is peaceful. In many ways, for me as a black person that I speak about, this topic about so often against us, black people, migration, and Canada history, I also concede that the original owners of this land have been treated in a way that their humanity is often being questioned. And up to this historical moment, indigenous people always have to answer and shout at the top of the roof that they are also human and deserve to be treated. So in many ways, I don't think I have sufficient complaint to make, because if the true owners of this land are being treated this way, what would it not be done to a foreigner like me? During the apartheid regime in South Africa, there is a slogan that was often repeated, and the slogan goes like this: our struggle is the struggle of memory against forgetfulness. Oftentimes, a lot of questions have been asked about how spaces come to be what kind of spaces get produced, as well as who produce them, and for what purpose do those spaces get closed, get open up. This has become part of the intellectual debate for a long time, and I think that if I am addressing the field of geography, this is one place that these questions are often debated about and oftentimes answered. But to the uninformed mind, the idea that space is always presumed to be empty, innocent, and people or nature that fill the space, happen in such organic way. So if we are to accept this logic, then the assumption is that spaces just evolve, organically. So whether we are talking about wealthy neighborhood or poor neighborhood, or even bodies that fill in those spaces, like Black people or indigenous people in our place, in a place that today we call Canada, the presumption is that everything happened organically. And in the process, what gets sidelined or deflected in the conversation is how institutional policies and practices work together in a sort of a colluded way to ensure that certain bodies are positioned differently within those spaces. So the essence of my presentation today is to sort of invite a broader conversation in terms of how do we understand the place of Black people within Canadian history? Is it an organically manufactured process that somehow, when we look at all the pillars and all the aspects of our social and human and economic relationship, Black people appear to be struggling, and in many cases, struggling alongside indigenous people at every economic indicators. How did this come to be? And those are some of the questions that I am hoping we can engage in today's discussion. The Black scholar Emerada Thornhill, in her article, So Seldom for Us, So Often Against Us, noted that Black people and the laws of Canada have often colluded with institutional structures and mechanisms to ensure that our humanity and place in Canada is never fully recognized. And so in many ways, this presentation is an attempt to unravel what I consider to be anti-Black history in Canada, and also to accept the often repeated slogan that I mentioned earlier on, that Black peoples in Canada, our struggle has always been a struggle of memory against forgetfulness. So what I will be doing is that I will quickly take us through history in terms of when the first Black person came to Canada, and also take us along the line about the history of slavery in Canada, and what appears to be an unwelcome invitation for Black people who throughout history have migrated to Canada. And I'm not just looking at it only in the limited sense of history, but also to trace it back to our present moment. So for instance, if we are looking at the current circumstances, the student visa rejection rate for international students coming from sub-Saharan Africa is around 86%. But this is not unusual if we look at the fact that in 1910, Canada passed immigration law that made it clear that the land Canada is not a place for people of color. So in many ways, this is a build-up of something that throughout history has manifested itself in different ways to suggest that Black people in many ways should not be recognized in Canada, and somehow if we manage to sneak through, our humanity will not be fully recognized. The first Black person which has historically been recognized as the first to move to then what we call the New France was Matthew da Costa, who came here around 1608. He was an interpreter for the Mi'kmaq language for the governor of Acadia, Pierre Dugua. There is still school of thought that if he was a language interpreter, if he was interpreter for the Mi'kmaq language, then there is a possibility that he probably might have migrated to Canada earlier than 1608, but the 1608 is what is officially recognized. Now, contrary to the myth that Canada did not take part in slavery, actually Canada was actively involved in enslavement of black people, and also indigenous people were also enslaved in this land. And I also need to make clear that in my presentation, I will be laying a lot of emphasis on black people. This is not to suggest that the history of Canada migration, black people are the only people who have suffered. Actually, I'm not here to talk about suffering context, but because this presentation is in particular, I'm situating the conversation around the black community, I will be citing those examples, but I'm sure there are a lot of communities who have a lot to say about their experience, including communities that today are identified as white, who previously were not fully welcome in Canada. I mean, we all know the moment in Canadian history when the Jews that were running away from Holocaust, their ships were turned away from Canada. It's oftentimes ironic that today we somehow preach as if we have always been the lovers of Israel and the Jewish community. But anyway, that is how history gets written and gets reinstated. But the point of the matter is that the first person to be recorded in the history of Canada as the first slave or African slave was a 6-year-old boy from Madagascar. His name was Olivier Lejeune. Olivier Lejeune was brought to Canada around August 20th, 1628. There are also debates that Olivier perhaps came from the coastal place of Ghana, but that is not the point. The point is that he was the first person to be recognized as an enslaved person in Canada. But up to that point, slavery have not been legalized in Canada. Slavery got legalized in Canada around 1689, when then the Attorney General made a case to Prince Louis King Louis of France that slavery would be a very profitable venture for Canada. And at that time, Canada has also identified some gold mines, and they needed people to work on the mining sector. So based on the persuasive argument that were presented, including the economic advantage that slavery will bring to Canada economy, slavery was then legalized in the then New France. So through that process, a lot of things happened. So for instance, in 1743, there was a law that was passed to notarize and authenticate the bill of sales of 5 Africans by a businessman known as Charles Romy. We can also talk about the fact that in April 13, 1709, there was also another law that was passed. And the context of this law was there were individuals who were going around encouraging enslaved blacks and indigenous people that, look, humanity do not allow slavery, so they can go around and claim that they have obtained their freedom. So another law was passed, and the law clearly said that any indigenous person or any black person who have been purchased and who will be purchased shall be the property of those who have purchased them and will be their slaves. The 1709 law is somehow one of the laws in the history of Canada that make it clear that human being could be a property that could be bought and purchased. Now, I know I'm talking to Newfoundland, so it's also important for us to situate the conversation within Newfoundland context. The assumption that somehow Newfoundland didn't play any role in slave trade, that is not true. Beside the codfish, and the ram that also produced, in many ways supported the Newfoundland economy. Records also show that indeed some of the schooners or the boats that went to the coastal places in Africa to bring enslaved blacks here into Canada and also the Caribbean, at least some of the schooners were built in Canada. So for instance, one of the schooners was known as Toby, which was built in Newfoundland in 1783 and went to Angola to carry 245 people to Grenada. We also have another schooner that was built in 1785. Its name was called the Maria, and it also went to West Africa to bring 80 people. 93% of them were children. There was also another schooner known as Schooner Fly, which was built in 1781. It also went into Nigeria to pick 113 people, but it couldn't make it to the shore because the local people, rose up to challenge it, and they drove all the people that have taken them away. I needed to mention this particular book, what we call the Code du Noir, or the Black Code. Now, if you follow contemporary discussions, in particular in US, where sometimes you hear people saying that, well, this statement that the person has made is the Black Code. Well, it's not Black Code as, code in quotation. The Black Code was actually a book that was published in 1685. It was about 446-page book that prescribed how Black people are supposed to be governed and live their life in both North America and also in the Caribbean. Now remember that during the period of slavery, there were a lot of enslaved people who were living in the plantation with a few slave owners. So it was very important for their lives to be regulated in such a way that they will present protection and safety. Now, it's important for us to link this conversation because oftentimes whenever we are having a broader conversation around safety and security of this nation, remember that this safety and security is about exclusive people, and it is about protecting certain people from other people, and in particular protecting white communities from the dangers that is presented by people of color. So the Code du Noir makes certain specifications about things that are supposed to happen in terms of how Black people were supposed to live their lives. There are a few things that I am going to point out, which is very important for me in this conversation. One aspect of the code was the fact that shipping companies were given license to go to the coastal places of Africa to bring people there and bring them into North America as slaves. Now, the Code du Noir specifies how much is supposed to be paid for every single person that a shipping company was supposed to bring, which oftentimes they are supposed to bring a minimum of 1,000 people at each trip. For every single Black person that a shipping company brings, they will be paid 30 livre. Now, you need to understand that at that time, the value of a horse was 250 livre. So think about it. It would take the life of 8 Black people to make up the life of one horse. So when today we say Black Lives Matter and people say, well, all lives matter. Well, in a way, they may be right. Maybe, the value of Black lives was not even up to the value of an animal. But that was not the only thing that the Code du Noir also prescribed. In fact, the book indicated that Black people who were living in 2 different plantation homes are not supposed to meet together. So anywhere that 2 or more Black people coming from different plantation houses meet is supposed to be illegal. Now, does this ring bell? Where even in our contemporary communities, when Blacks assemble in a place that they have not been authorized by a white person, is supposed to be something that requires law enforcement officers to pay closer attention because there is a danger of them committing crime. But when they violate this law, their first offense is that they will be given a symbol. I mean, I'm sure you all remember and you all know where this symbol can be found even in the contemporary times. When we look at the Quebecois flag, this symbol is there. But this was the symbol that were given to enslaved Blacks that violated the Code du Noir. The first punishment is that this symbol will be tattooed on their right shoulder. And at the second offense, it will be put on the left shoulder. And the third offense, a judge has authority to pass a death sentence on them. So let's also look at the slavery in British North America. By the time that New France was conquered in 1758, there were about 3,600 enslaved blacks and indigenous people in New France. But the majority of these individuals were indigenous people. In fact, there were only 1,132 Africans who were living there. And the enslaved blacks, were in places like, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward, Quebec, Ontario, and other places. If you want to know the breakdown, there were 3,000 enslaved blacks who were living in British North, and there were 2,000 that were living in Quebec, in Prince Edward, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. There were 300 that were living in Upper Canada or Ontario. These are some of the prominent slave owners. Well, I brought this to show you the value of slaves, and that is how they were calculating the value of slaves. Black slaves were in comparison with the prices of sugar. So if you look at the chart, you realize that there were moments in our history where sugar was more expensive than black lives. Okay, so these are some of the prominent slave owners in in Canada, or then British North America. 5 out of the 16 members of the first Parliament of Upper Canada were slave owners. In the second Parliament of Upper Canada, 14 out of 17 members were slave owners or have family members who own slaves, who own black slaves. The slave owners cut across. We have Catholic priests who were also slave owners. James McGill, who is the member of who is the founder of McGill University, had 6 black slaves. The deputy superintendent of Indian Department, Matthew Elliott, had 60 black slaves. A British Army officer, Sir John Johnson, had 14 black slaves. John Askin, a military officer and a merchant owner, had 23 slaves. The upper town of what is today known as Toronto, the provincial secretary of that place, William Jarvis, and actually, if you could go to Toronto, the downtown, they have a street named after him. He had 6 black slaves. So the list goes on. I mean, I'm just bringing this out just to let you know in terms of slavery was something that was very, very popular. Let me just, for purpose of time, quickly take you through the first race rout that happened in Shelburne County. Oftentimes, when we talk about the slave rout, we are often quick to talk about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But before that, a slave rout happened in Canada, and that was the first race rout that happened. And it happened because there were a few. Let me quickly take us through the context. During the American War of Revolution, the British promised black slaves freedom and land if they helped them in the war against the Americans. So between 1783 and 1785, about 3,500 free black slaves moved to Nova Scotia. Now, when they came, they were not the only loyalists that came. In fact, there were over 30,000 loyalists that came. Majority of them were white. But the British did not fulfill the promise of giving them land. So what happened was that there were quite a number of free black slaves that were actually working for labor to some of the white landowners. The difference is that these were individuals who were previously slaves in the US, who were working for free. So they've moved into a new environment where they now work and get paid. So their labor was slightly cheaper than the white laborers. And so there was a sort of anger and rage among the white laborers who felt like the blacks is actually not only cheaping the labor market, but they are also stealing their jobs. Does this sound familiar? They are stealing their jobs. So around that time, One of the, that was on July 26, 1784, there was a black priest that was accused to have baptized, a white convert, and that enraged 40 white loyalists, who were living in Nova Scotia. So they went with chains and with, weapons, and went and beat a lot of the black community, destroyed their properties. And the rout went on for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, there were houses and possession of at least 23 blacks that were destroyed and were burnt. So after the rout, life became so difficult for many blacks that they were not able to stay. So the government then offered, the British government offered opportunity that people who are willing will be allowed to relocate to Sierra Leone. So if you have heard the history about how people migrated from Canada to Freetown in Sierra Leone, that was the reason. There was also what we call the indenture servitude, which is also another form of slavery. But this time you go into labor to pay off the debt. And indenture servitude was also extreme form of exploitation. And one individual who was living around Prince Edward, his name was Dimbo Sarkos, was one of the such indenture workers. Because of time, I will just rush through, because there are a few things that I really want us to cover. So I won't talk about the 1793 Act that limits slavery in Upper Canada. But all this while there was an effort to actually fight against black enslavement. And I need to again be clear about history, that it wasn't every white person who was involved in enslavement. In fact, there were a lot of black, progressive whites who also were against enslavement of black people, and they became some of the voices that supported the abolitionist movement. But those struggle was more popular in Upper Canada, that is around Ontario area. Whereas in terms of the Lower Canada, we were actually doubling down. So in places like Nova Scotia, Prince Edward, New Brunswick, they were actually doubling down on slavery, to the sense that they tried to legalize slavery again. There was already a law, but in 1801 in New Brunswick they tried to re-legalize slavery, and in Nova Scotia in 1808 they wanted to do that. Whereas in Upper Canada, in Ontario area, they have passed the 1793 Act to limit enslavement of black people. So these are some of the newspapers, captions of enslaved blacks in Quebec and others. Again, I am mindful of time and I have a lot of things to cover, so I want to rush through. And this is also sale of slaves in Halifax, and that was published in the Gazette in May 30th, 1752. There were also stories about providing reward for people who will be able to help black slaves who have run away. Now, I know there have been a lot of conversation about reparation, but what is oftentimes not mentioned is that actually reparation were paid when slavery was abolished in 1834. Reparation were paid, but they were not paid to enslaved blacks. They were paid to white slave owners. And the British government paid out £20 million to 3,000 white families who owned slaves in 1833. Now, this money would equate to 16.5 billion pounds, in the present day market. And some of the slave owners who, got some of this money have risen into a prominent position, including, the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, whose family were slave owners and benefited from this reparated money. But for the purpose of argument, just let's quickly talk about the fugitive Slaves Act of 1850, because this somehow has become the foundation where anytime we are talking about the black people and our migration to Canada, we conveniently start from here, because this is where the Underground Railroad started. The Fugitive Act was an actual sort of a compensation to the southern part of US who felt that their participation in the Union was not benefiting them, because at that time there were certain aspects, in particular the northern part of the US, where slavery had been limited. So slavery were not being practiced in places like New York and other places around that time. So what was also happening again, where there were cases where few progressive whites would even go into a plantation and fight slave owners to enslave, enslave blacks and help them to escape to the northern part. So this became a big worry for the southern slave owners, who threatened that they were going to cease to be part of the Union if nothing was done. So they passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and the law basically saying that it is the responsibility of any individual to help slave catchers to return a fugitive slave or an escaped slave back to their owners. Again, anybody who harbored a fugitive slave is actually in violation of the law. Now, I need to mention that what made this law very dangerous for black people and why it opened door for the Underground Railroad to Canada was because when the slave catchers meet a black person, you are supposed to show them that you have your certificate of freedom. And as soon as they take the certificate of freedom, they will burn it in front of you. And without the certificate of freedom, nothing that shows that you are indeed free. So there were a lot of examples of free blacks who were kidnapped and sent back to the southern part to be enslaved again. Now, you need to understand that when slavery was finally abolished in US in 1863, the slave catchers were enrolled into the police institution. So when black people don't trust policing, you need to understand that we have a long history. But that is not the point of our conversation today. When the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, it became clear that nowhere in the United States was safe for a black person. So it was at this time, because slavery, remember, had been abolished in the British colony, which included Canada. So this opened up the Underground Railroad, where a lot of black people were able to escape. And in fact, in all, over 60,000 blacks were able to escape to Canada through Underground Railroad. And we all know the important role that individuals like Harriet Tubman played. What is important to us, because we talk so much about Canada's important role in the Underground Railroad and how they helped save enslaved blacks that were escaping slavery. What is oftentimes not told is the unwelcoming atmosphere that were created for black immigrants. And in many cases, the extent of white hostility towards black people. And this is why I am building on the argument that the laws and the practice in Canada has so often been against black people. There were a lot of, in the first place, there were a lot of meetings that were held and a lot of complaints, rallies that were made insisting that black people should not be allowed to migrate to Canada. I mean, for us, it's not a new thing. But the situation became so deplorable. Some of them were, the idea that they didn't even want to live closer to black people, or they didn't want black people to live closer to their property, because they work with this idea that if blacks are living closer to you, somehow the value of your house go down. So the situation became so deplorable that at a certain point, and in 1863, the United States Freedom Inquiry Commission, the Inquiry Commission is was set up, to investigate their well-being. It was part of the abolitionist movement who were trying to find out how is the state of being of black people living in Canada. And Samuel Grady Howe was the one who was sent to do the investigation. And this is what he wrote as part of his report. It's a very interesting report, and if you are interested, I can send it to you. This is what this is an aspect of what he wrote. The Canadian boast that their laws know no difference of color, that they protect all their rights. The very frequency of the assertion and of the admission proves that it is not considered a matter of course that simple justice should be done. People do not boast that the law protects white men. The truth of the matter seems to be that as long as the colored people form a very small proportion of the population and are dependent, they receive protections and favors. But then when they increase and compete with the laboring class for a living, and especially when they begin to aspire to social equality, they cease to be interesting Negroes and become N-words. Now, it's also worthy to mention that when slavery was finally abolished, that is Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, where slavery was abolished in the United States, out of the 60,000 that escaped to Canada through Underground Railroad, 40,000 returned to US because life and condition here was so deplorable for them that they couldn't afford to live here. But this is not the only thing. For those that stayed behind, there were elements of racial segregation of black people in the school system. Now, remember that up to the point of the Jim Crow law, up to this point, there was no racial segregation in the US in the school system because the Jim Crow law have not been introduced. So when we talk about the Board of Education versus Brown versus the Board of Education, what we don't often talk about was the 1855 Washington versus Trustee of Charlottesville in Canada here, where that was the first time that a matter related to racial segregation in the school system was contested at the Supreme Court. So in many ways, Canada started racial segregation before US took it, and of course US perfected it. But these are a few examples of our racial segregation. So these were some of the letters of protest that black people wrote, talking about their experience about racial segregation in the school system. But given the fact that we are talking about universities, these are examples of racial segregation that happened in the universities in Canada. So we talk about racial segregation, in places like McGill University, University of Toronto, Queen's University. So for instance, in 1918, the University Senate of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, voted to ban black students from further admission into the Queen's medical program. And they blamed their decision on the fact that there was racial intolerance among white residents at Kingston. So they did not want any physical contact with black physicians. Now, this anti-black restriction within Queen's University they stopped practicing it until it was in session until 1965, but the law remained in Queen's University books until 2018, just 3 years ago, when it was finally removed. We also have to mention that McGill University also had restriction to the admission of black students between 1920s to 1930s, and again from 1945 until 1960s. Black students in Montreal were barred from doing any of their internships at hospitals in Montreal between 1930 and 1945. And so black students who wanted to do their internship have to go to Howard University in Washington to do that. Dalhousie University also banned black people from 1911 to 1931, claiming that, and by 1930s, only one hospital in Nova Scotia, the tuberculosis hospital, that allowed black medical students to complete their internship there. University of Toronto also denied admission to black applicants in the 1920s. And in a letter correspondence regarding this situation, the university said that they didn't know that the person was a black person. So this is so much about the racial segregation within the university system. Now let's also look at the anti-black racism in the immigration policies and practices in Canada from 1901 to 1965. And all this while, there were a lot of efforts that were done to discourage black people from migrating to Canada. So one of them was, for instance, and all this started around 1910 when, between 1905 and 1992, there were a lot of black people that were migrating to Canada. But in 1910, black farmers in Oklahoma wrote and expressed interest to migrate to Canada because they heard that there were promise of land being given to people who migrate from US to Canada. And as soon as the Canadian immigration minister heard it, first of all, they sent somebody to do investigation if indeed the letter came from black families, because as far as they were concerned, black people don't know how to read, and therefore they couldn't believe that the letter was written from them. And when they confirmed that indeed the letter was written by black farmers, then they sent a team to discourage them that they shouldn't come to Canada, because first of all, the Canada border is really not conducive for black people, because when you come, they strip search black people, women and children in presence of their husband. So that they shouldn't really open themselves. And besides, why do they even want to come to Canada? The place is really cold and it's not all that really good as they are hearing it. Well, despite all this effort, some of the black migrants from US still tried to come. So this is what they did. The immigration policy changed the rules and said that any black person that was coming to Canada must submit themselves to a medical test. But that was not the only thing. The medical examination, Canada have their own set of doctors that they have to go to, which is not different from contemporary times when you are applying for permanent residency, that Canada have their own doctors that you have to go. But what happened at that time was that the Canadian government made a promise to the medical doctors that for any black applicants that you fail, you will receive an additional $20 incentives. I don't know whether I should call it bribe, but it sounds like one. But that was not the only thing. On March 31st, 1911, what we call an Imperial Order of the Daughters of Empire, the IOD, which was the Edmonton chapter, petitioned the Minister of Interior, claiming that allowing black immigrants to come to Canada put white women at risk, given the fact that there is a possibility that white women here will be raped. So they really insisted that the immigration policy should not allow black people to come. After several petitions were made, finally a bill was sent to Parliament, and the bill made it clear that the act was simply saying that for a period of 1 year and from after the date thereof, the landing in Canada shall be, and the same is prohibited, of any immigrant belonging to the Negro race, which race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirement of Canada. So the law was clear that blacks were considered to be unsuitable for the Canadian environment. The order was adopted on August 12, 1911, and signed by then Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, except that they didn't follow it through. As to why it didn't happen, we really don't know. But the intent of anti-black racism was really clear. I've already talked about the administrative barriers that were put in place, making sure that black people were not allowed to come to Canada. I will, because of time, I won't talk about the domestic service workers, because that will take us, But I call this the unforgivable blackness, that somehow, no matter whatever is happening, we have not allowed it to go. And the unforgivable blackness speaks to the extent to which there has always been a hostility. And there are a lot of examples to cite about many racial segregation that prevent black people from even going to theater, or when we go to theater and paid money, we were restricted or limited to certain spaces. And this unforgivable blackness have not stopped. For instance, if we right now look at the Canadian consulate around the globe, the whole West Africa, with over 15 countries, we have 2 Canadian embassies. That is serving 15 countries. Whereas when you go to Hong Kong, there are more than 2, Canadian, consulate there. But this speaks to a pattern that is gradually becoming clear, that even in our element of claiming to be very progressive, the element of anti-black racism within the Canadian policies and immigration practices has still not toned down. That every time there is a sense, there is an unwritten rule. And an example that I give is the recent pattern of the student study permit and the visa refusal. And this is just a few examples. That you can look at people, a group of students that are being refused, and those who are being refused at the highest rate. So, but what even makes it more difficult in terms of our conversation today is this erasure of history. That up to this present moment, even when and we all know that our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is considered progressive, but when he was asked whether he will apologize to the black community for the role of Canada, the role Canada played in the enslavement of black people, he couldn't give a definite answer. And it is just recently that Canada, in sort of official way, acknowledging that enslavement of black people happened in this land. But I brought a YouTube link that there is a graveyard in Ontario. This place was originally, the community was founded by black people. But now the residents have gone to the graveyard and destroyed all remaining, signs and stones that indicate that the original people who were occupying there were black people. This is not just one off, but it is a follow-up pattern within our history, where our presence, our role in the building of Canada has always been erased. And in many cases, our humanity have never and often never been recognized. That for some reason, there is always an effort to bury our presence and the role that we've contributed in making Canada what it is. And for black people, this is the cruelest transgression against us. The unwillingness of white Canadians to acknowledge our place in Canada history. So we are often seen as an outsider. That's why we can be the 7th generation Canadian. We are always asked the question, where do you come from? Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for up here for a speaker? Or
Thanks so much for that. And as someone who is a student of Canadian history, I actually learned a lot too. I know some of these themes, but you introduced actually really quite a number of important themes. My question, I guess, bringing it a little bit into the present, and you make an extremely important point about like the organized forgetting that mainstream society does. But you mentioned the experience of contemporary immigrants, especially from Africa or other Black Caribbeans, etc., coming to Canada. What is the relationship and awareness of more contemporary immigrants and a sense of connection to that history? Or does it feel like if say an international student comes from Ghana today, I mean, do they connect with that history of Blackness in Canada? And are there ways of trying to put that together, maybe through your educational work or other things?
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah.
Because they are not even aware of this history. And for me, that has also been one of the, when I said our struggle is the struggle of memory against forgetfulness. If there is anything that global racism and colonialism have done effectively, is the ability to go to the past of the colonial subject and remove the past, or in some cases distort it. So yes, we've had, I will tell you one of the reasons that motivated me into even doing this work. When I saw a Black person having the tattoo, Frodi, as a tattoo that they have as a fashion, I thought that, okay, something needs to be done. So yes, unfortunately, no.
Yeah, interesting. And sorry, just to follow that, and obviously the link between that and the Indigenous experience, which is what you opened up with, which I thought, there's so many connections there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much connection, and again, time wouldn't give me the opportunity to talk in a broader sense. And in many ways, the more you look into this issue, the more you understand why, even in the present Canada, Indigenous and Black people appear to be at the bottom of almost every economic pillars. Because somehow, I'm not saying that our struggles are the same. It's in different form, but in many cases, there are areas of connections too. And so some of the pains and the agony that Black people have gone through, Indigenous people have equally gone through the same thing. And one of the successful aspects of that, of erasing Indigenous history, was the residential school. Which ironically happened in Ghana, except that we didn't see it as residential school.
Just boarding school.
Boarding school.
Yeah.
But not only that, in fact, in some of the communities that European introduced early education, they built what we call asylum schools, because the local people were resistant to some of the cultural reforms that the European education were introducing into the community. So the asylum school was built in a way to bring those people to come into those schools so that they will not be part of the community. So there are some similarities, and of course there are also huge differences.
I wanted to broaden up the conversation a little bit, simply because what we're seeing today is really kind of reflecting a lot of what history is about, which is us against them, whoever that is, right? And I think, when the university, for instance, are starting to embrace this equity, diversity, inclusiveness, right? We have reason to do that, but it doesn't seem to stick simply because there is that things about people seem to be a bit more comfortable with people who they can relate to, and not those that are different. And we see that in everything, including religion, reason, right? So I'm trying to figure it out, because I see this as a very big issue for the world at the moment. You want to talk about justice, you want to talk about safety and security. Look at what happened in Norway just like 2 years ago. Right? So what would it take to really to really make people feel a bit more comfortable with being among people who are different from,
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question that you've raised, and I'm not sure if I will be able to provide a more convincing answer, because it is a question that requires us to do further unpacking. But I have heard this argument several times that, it's human nature to gravitate towards that which is, familiar, and therefore we see the unfamiliar as foreign. What makes that statement a bit tricky for me is the fact that when we are looking at inclusivity, it is not only limited to the question of race. There is also issues of gender, sexuality, and other differences. One would have thought that the working class white will see their allyship in the working class black indigenous, because, of course, the working class are struggling against the economic exploitation of the middle class and upper class. However, class has never been an issue or a barrier in terms of linking people of racial background. Let me put it this way. When I see working class, rooting for Donald Trump, notwithstanding his long history of somebody who has been indulging in economic exploitation, I am forced to ask the question, is whiteness the best way of coalescing people, or should class also be the factor? Because this is an area that, when we look at the logic that Karl Marx was pushing across, that class consciousness will only come to be when the working class come together. What Karl Marx analysis failed to look at is the importance of whiteness and how whiteness has the potential to coalesce body around itself, to the sense that people will forget economic differences. And it's not just class. We can also look at gender differences. That even, and I would, when Trusogina, when white feminist group were at the early stages fighting for the right to vote, and Trusogina showed up, the white women didn't want her to talk, because they were afraid that she was going to bring race in the conversation. And so Trusogina, made a very important speech, which has become, one of the seminal work that have been written about anti-black, feminist work. Am I not also a woman? So it brings, and this is where I am struggling, that if indeed it is human nature to gravitate those that are familiar, how come the gravitation appears to go only along the line of race, but not gender, not sexuality, not economic differences? But even more importantly, why is it that working class whites often get resented, not towards the upper class or middle class, but to other working class minorities, because, quote unquote, they are stealing their jobs? But the broader point is still not negating the fact that, how do we talk about inclusion and diversity in an era where these are also important questions about human tendency to gravitate towards that which is familiar? But perhaps we need to rethink about how we talk about inclusion, not so much about adding what is missing, but rather asking the question, what are we including people into? Because oftentimes that has been the danger. And our university searches have been so good about talking about inclusion, about who is missing and where do we add. But what are we adding and where are we adding people into are equally important. Because trust me, if you add black person like me into your spaces, expect me to come with my black attitude and question. And if you are not ready for those attitudes and questions, then we need to redefine what inclusion really means.
Wonderful. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Dr. Adjei. so much for that.